of everything.
Now, I want to spend the 5-10 minutes of my speech explaining why I think the British public should make policy and not Parliament. I don't think we can trust our elected elites to make policy. And I'm going to talk about British foreign policy because that's the area I know most about. I don't think the British elite should be trusted to make foreign policy. They shouldn't be trusted to decide how we relate to other countries because they're basically terrible at it. It's not a question that Britain has a basically benign policy. We actually have a fundamentally evil strategy for dealing with other countries. I mean that. I use that moral term on purpose. It's an evil. It really is fundamentally evil. It systematically denies human rights to large parts of the world's population. Denies successful peace processes in places like Israel, and disrupts the process of getting more freedom, which a lot of third world countries have been going through since the 1960s when they got independence. Now, I'll give you two examples because I think it's good to have two specific examples of what you mean before you make a big statement like that. First, I'll talk about Julian Assange, who's a foreign journalist, an Australian journalist, who's being treated absolutely appallingly by the British government. And then I'll talk about Libya. I just read an article recently which had something very interesting to say about the Libyan attack and now its consequences for that country. And not just for that country, for the whole world. But let me start with Julian Assange. So, Julian Assange was in the Embassy of Ecuador for 7 years, where he was seeking asylum from the United States. The US wanted to put him in prison for life for revealing some of their war crimes in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. The United Kingdom had a very interesting role to play in this. As soon as he went into the embassy, they surrounded the embassy with police. They wanted to arrest him and extradite him to the US, where he would face those charges. Or those, not charges, excuse me, he was never charged with anything, but face those accusations. Now, I'm particularly interested in this claim made by certain members of Parliament that we're just enforcing the law. Julian Assange is not above the law. You know, they say he was hiding from rape charges made against him in Sweden. This is a lie on multiple levels. Not only is the definition of rape completely different in Sweden, and we don't use that definition at all. Second of all, the two women who made those charges, and these were not charges, these were accusations, they didn't want to They didn't think that he'd actually raped them. You can see their police testimonies yourself. If you don't believe me, you can read their own testimonies. They just wanted him to get an HIV test. But I'll leave you to find out a bit more about the background. I want to talk about a specific thing. This claim that Britain is upholding the law. Well, let me point you to a very good writer called Jonathan Cook. Jonathan Cook says that Britain has actually been breaking the law in 17 different ways. 17, he goes through all the different ways Britain has been breaking the law with the Julian Assange case. I'll just give you 3 examples. I don't want to give you 17 examples. The first example I found very interesting. William Hague, the Foreign Secretary at the time when Julian Assange went into the embassy, he threatened to send in the Metropolitan Police to arrest Assange from the embassy. What he's doing when he does this is basically tearing up the Vienna Convention. That's a very strict convention which says you cannot go into foreign diplomatic soil and just at any time you want. That's akin to an invasion, actually, to do that.
Did he do that?
He didn't do that, but this is a clear case of someone who's not interested in the law, of a state, a British government, which is not interested in the law. That's one example. The other interesting example is the United Nations. The United Nations made a very clear legal ruling, which Britain cooperated in the investigation process of. The legal ruling said that Julian Assange was being arbitrarily detained, that he needed to be released immediately and given compensation, and given safe passage to a country of his choosing. The UK just didn't listen. The UK had no time for that particular international law. So that's the second way. The third way, which is the most recent example, now Julian Assange was extracted out of the embassy and put in Belmarsh prison for very interesting propaganda reasons, which I could go into if you want to ask me later. When that happened, the UK government allowed some US prosecutors to go into the embassy to take Assange's belongings and have a look through them without a United Nations official present and without any of Julian Assange's lawyers present. That's also a violation of not just international law, that's violating Britain's own laws. I always thought this country was a country that valued property, personal property. That principle of respect for someone's private property. I thought that was very central to the English state. But apparently, when it comes to Julian Assange, when it comes to foreign journalists to expose Western war crimes, they can make an exception. So that's I've just given you 3 examples. I really urge you have a look at Jonathan Cook's article. He goes through the 17 ways in which this has not been about enforcing the law, but this has been about persecuting a journalist.
But he was his own worst enemy.
Broke international law by disobeying the UN. What's the legal remedy?
What's the legal remedy? Yeah, follow the law.
Break international law.
Follow the law.
You'd be taken to the Hague.
The United Kingdom should just follow the law, so they should give Julian Assange immediate release, and they should. Oh, did you have more? Sorry, I didn't hear you. What was the other part of that question?
What if Britain has broken international law? What is the remedy in international law? Why aren't we being taken to the Hague?
That's the thing is, Julian Assange actually, it's an interesting case with him. The problem with international law is that, like labour law, international labour law is a good example of this. Both the International Labour Organization and the United Nations, they don't have any executive power. They can't enforce their law. It requires the willing cooperation of countries to carry the law out. Now, Britain has a long history of not obeying international law. And actually for me, I always thought the rule of law is a general concept, national, local, whatever. That was another very basic British idea as well. I always thought rule of law was a basic British value, going all the way back to Magna Carta, when we said to King John that he couldn't just do whatever he wanted, that he had to respect the rights of nobility and he had to respect the right of peasants to the forest.
Magna Carta said nothing.
This
for
Magna
peasants,
Carta
it only
was,
applied to barons.
in many ways, was supposed to be the laying the groundwork for the rule of law, and yet now we're sort of walking all over it. By we, I don't mean us, the people. We respect the law. We are just law-abiding people. It's a British state which acts as a rogue state and just does whatever it wants when it doesn't suit it. The case of Iraq is a very obvious example, but there are many ways in which Britain has undermined international legal proceedings. So I've spoken about Julian Assange. I hope that's answered your question.
Well, not really.
It's not really answered your question. The answer is basically Britain.
I'm also not sure it was actually a UN legal ruling. It's just an opinion from a UN rapporteur, somebody who gives a view on something. It doesn't got before to international law. I may be wrong.
No, when the United Nations rules, that was a ruling. It was a ruling. You can look it up yourself. I've read the document myself and I've gone through it, and it is a legal ruling. I can answer your question, and then can I actually? It's not a long speech. I just want to talk about Libya and then wrap it up. So, could you?
No, it's just if we deported Julian Assange to Sweden for the rape, because you said these women didn't think they'd been raped. That doesn't necessarily mean they weren't raped.
So you got to speak up. I can't hear you.
Sorry, if we deport Julian Assange to Sweden, is he more likely to be deported to America or extradited to America from Sweden than here?
In both cases, it's very likely. Both Sweden and Britain they have a very, you can just read, there's a CIA analyst called Paul, I can't remember his surname, but I can find it for you. And he said, do you think Sweden is a neutral country and you don't think it's in America's sphere of influence? And that's a big mistake. It's very much like Britain. Its intelligence services have a very strong working relationship with American intelligences, and they don't want to lose that relationship. So they're often very willing to cooperate on matters like Assange. So yeah, I think it's just as likely to be from Sweden as from Britain. I mean, remember, Julian Assange's lawyers repeatedly asked the Swedish authorities, because remember, Julian Assange wanted to be investigated about these rape allegations. He said he wanted to be investigated. He had nothing to hide. He said, I'm happy to go to Sweden on the condition you do not extradite me to the United States. I'm happy to go to... He said that repeatedly, and the Swedish authorities never gave him that reassurance. Never.
But they couldn't do that.
Of course they can. Of course they can.
Well, they can't if they want to follow international law.
But now, I'm not going to go too much on the Assange case.
Well, just one thing I want to say about Assange is that I had a lot of sympathy with him, I still do, and Britain has no right to detain him, but he made himself his own worst enemy. During the whole time he was in that embassy, he was rude to the staff, he never washed, so he smelt like a polecat, He smeared the toilet walls with his own excrement. Come on, if people are doing
So
you a
how old-
favour
how
by
old are
giving you
you?
hospitality, if you people are
That's a rather
doing you a
racist
favour by
comment.
giving you,
How old
if
are you?
people are
Literally.
doing you
No,
a
I'm saying
favour
he's
by
acting
giving
like
you
a child. You should act your own age.
if people are giving you hospitality and doing you a favour, you don't rub them up the wrong way, and
So
he did,
all of these,
and that's
all
why
of these
they threw him
claims,
out.
all of these claims are worth being dismissed. Do you know why? Do you know what? There's a good reason. The staff that made up these lies, these rumours, which have no evidence at all. Remember, let's just use
That's
logic
why
for
they
a second.
withdrew the asylum from
Let's
him,
use
because he
logic
made
for a
himself such
second.
pain
When
in
somebody
the
says
butt
something,
to
you need
them.
to have evidence for it. There was no evidence for this. The people who made up those claims, first of all, they're anonymous, but if they are from the embassy, we know who they are. They're from Lenin Moreno's government. So Rafael Correa was the one who gave Julian Assange political asylum, legally claimed his right to political asylum from a hostile enemy, the U.S. This is his enemy, right? He's trying to imprison him for just reporting the truth. When he went into the embassy, they were very sympathetic to him. You can find pictures and videos of him celebrating his birthday with
but the
them,
way he behaved
having a
turned
great
against
time.
him.
He had a wonderful time with them for years, actually, considering the very harsh situation that Britain and America had put
They
Assange
cut off
under.
his internet, or is that
Now, what happened was, when Lenin Moreno got elected, the hard right-wing leader took over in Ecuador, you saw a complete change of tune. They started to persecute Assange. They started to treat him terribly. They started to cut off his internet, you mentioned that. They started to do all kinds of things to make his life miserable. You can follow, if you look carefully, this was the change that happened. After this happened, then you had all the claims about smearing feces on the walls, all kinds of ridiculous, just childish. That's why I say, at your age, you're a grown man, you shouldn't just find the stuff titillating and... Yeah, you might think it's patronising. I think it's patronising to a journalist who's done so much for us.
If people are giving you hospitality,
So much
you
of-
don't abuse it.
Well, you can believe that if you want to. You can believe whatever you want, but it's wrong.
They helped
Sorry,
him out in a
there's
tight
no evidence that
corner,
that's
and that's the
happened.
way he rewarded them. I mean, he's his own worst
You haven't
enemy.
answered the gentleman's question. What's the remedy when UK violate UK laws and international laws? He means remedy, he means what's the response, what's the punishment for this? What's the
I just told you. No, I answered your question already. I answered your question. I said to you that the United Nations doesn't have any executive power.
So this means...
So it can't just take Britain to The Hague or
this
take
means UK,
William Hague to
US,
The Hague.
UK, USA, Germany, these powerful countries, they are in charge of the laws. So when they violate the laws, no response, no punishment, no penalty.
You can't punish. First of all,
This is the
you
question,
can
I think.
you can bring a case to The Hague. That's possible, and you can.
They are in
It
charge.
can be enforced
They are in
through
charge of the
through
Hague.
certain US and European agencies. It can be.
When it
But
comes to national
international
interest,
law doesn't have any binding.
this
Well, it's
thing
binding, but it
can't
doesn't
be
have any, like I said, executive power. Any power to enforce it. Can't be enforced. It can only be enforced by the will of the states at hand. That's how it works. So I've just given you. So you asked me what the remedy is. The remedy is not to just rely on the United Nations. The remedy is for the British people to try and get Britain to enforce the law, to use non-violent action, to use lobbying. These are the ways the British public can use their power, which they have considerable amounts of, free time and energy and resources and intellectual resources. They can do that. They can pressure the British government to obey international law and bring about a fair settlement to Julian Assange. That's possible. It's been done in the past with other cases, and it can be done
What
again.
the relationship is between Assange and Trump and Farage, or is that all made up?
Again, I haven't seen any evidence at all that Assange
know
has been
Farage
coordinating with Nigel Farage. What these are basically attempts by the media to make Assange look like a hard right sympathiser, and to make nice liberal English people who might actually take to the streets on something like this. Because remember, this is violating things like free
why
speech,
was Farage
free
there?
press. If you're going to let me answer your questions, you've got to do them one by one. I can't just...
Well, it's the same question.
Farage visited, that thousands of people visited. Literally, he was in there for 7 years. Thousands of people visited that embassy. All right? So I don't see anything particularly unusual about Nigel Farage visiting. I think lots of politicians visited him. And also, free speech and the free press are not particularly left-wing or liberal values. Someone like Nigel Farage can believe in them just as much as anyone else. I say this, and I despise the man, but I believe that he can have those values just as much as anyone else.
Can I ask another question?
No, I'm going to
last
finish my
question.
speech and then I'll take questions. So, the next part of my speech was about Libya. So, actually, before I go on, there's a very interesting activist you should check out called Kieran O'Reilly. He's come to Speaker's Corner before, and he did a 100-day vigil outside of the embassy. Very remarkable man. I think if you ever have time to check out any one of the activists who's been involved in the Assange solidarity movement. Kieran O'Reilly is the most interesting one. You can even fund him as well. You can support him. He has a GoFundMe website. So, but yeah, that's just a digression. Let me get back to my main idea. The reason why British foreign policy is so terrible is because we let the British elites make it, and we don't make it ourselves. If the British public decided how we related to the rest of the world, then Britain would relate to the rest of the world in a healthy way, not an unhealthy way, like a more sound and logical way. The example of Libya is a very good case in point. When Britain collaborated with the US and France in destroying Libya, what happened was something very interesting consequences happened. Two very dangerous, ungoverned spaces tore open. The fabric of Libya was torn open. In the west you had Sabratha, and in the east you had Benghazi. Oh, sorry, it was the other way around. In the east you had Benghazi, and in the west you had Sabratha. And by the way, I'm getting all this from a very interesting British historian called Mark Curtis, who I collaborated with a while ago on some research in a very small way. Wonderful historian. You can check out his website. What happened was, when that western piece of fabric tore out of Libya, you had an ungoverned space awash with weapons, awash with radical Islamists ready to train up, willing young men to go into battle. And remember, NATO had actually been collaborating with some of these radical Islamists to oust Gaddafi. So when they got rid of the colonel, they met their short-term aim of getting rid of the colonel, but they didn't think that the people they collaborated with to do that would one day turn on us. This is radical Islamists don't care. They get help from the West to get rid of Gaddafi. They don't honor that relationship, but they're going to be happy to turn their guns on us, and that's exactly what they did. So what happened was, you had the Manchester bomber. Manchester bomber came out of that ungoverned space. You also had the Port El Kantai machine gunner who attacked about, I think it was 24 or 3 people as they came out of a hotel in Tunisia. Most of these people are British. These people were gunned down. Those are two examples, but France has been struck. Germany's been struck by you had in Berlin, the market lorry attack. That was done by someone trained up in Libya. Now, according to Mark Curtis, terrorism has spread to 14 different countries since the attack on Libya. Since Britain, France, and America, since Cameron, Sarkozy, and Obama wrecked that country, they opened it up to all kinds of, power abhors a vacuum. It's like gravity; it just can't exist without. It has to be filled up, right? That vacuum. And the toughest and nastiest men took over in those parts of North Africa. Now, this is, for me, a clear example of how British foreign policy can have terrible consequences for the rest of the world. By the way, it's not just rich countries like France and Tunisia even, and Britain and Germany. There are countries like Egypt have been affected, Morocco's been affected, a lot of other places in the third world, in that region, 14 countries in total. So I've given you two examples, terrible British foreign policies, which are only that bad because the elites make the policies. If we made those policies, hold on 1 second, if the elites made those policies, if the public made them, if we decided through face-to-face assemblies of the people at local levels how we want to relate to the rest of the world, then I think we'd have a much more ethical, logical, sound relationship with the rest of the world. Britain wouldn't be looked on and feared and despised by a lot of the third world. It would be seen as a helpful force for good. That's what I think we could be, and that's what we should be. But we need a democratic revolution to take back our country. That's what we need.
So the point about Gaddafi is he wasn't without funding things like that himself. So he supposedly funded the aircraft. That was down to him, and he did other things. So he was. I mean, whatever you think of it, he was also arming or letting the IRA train.
Do you know what's very interesting? There was
So it's just a matter.
But this again demonstrates
how you deal with Gaddafi. It's not do you not deal with it.
This again demonstrates the duplicity of British elites. It's quite interesting. So there was an IRA attack, and they had been using Libyan weapons to carry it out. The British victims of those attacks, do you know what they did? They actually lobbied the British government to try and get Libya to apologise for that, to try and get Gaddafi to apologise. And at the time, Britain had a very good relationship with Libya. It wasn't the relationship they had up until 2011. At that time, Gaddafi was kind of playing ball. He was trying to actually see if he could ward off an attack by the West and, open up some of their oil to the West. So Britain didn't want to actually get them to apologize. So Britain is actually willing to put its trade deals, well, I say Britain, the British elites are willing to put their trade deals with countries like Libya above getting justice for victims of IRA attacks. So listen, sorry? No, this lady makes a good point. It's not just Britain, it's the great powers. It's the great power. This is why it's in the nature of being a great power. If Britain wants to be this force actively shaping the world, then they often feel like this is what they need to do. France does it as well. Italy, Russia, China, they all play this game. America is the most important one. America is by far and away the most powerful country in the world. Far more powerful than Russia's got an economy the size of Spain. America really is the hyperpower, as some people have called it. I think that's a good way to put it. It's not just a superpower, hyperpower. All of the great powers behave this way. But I think I'd rather live in a normal country than a great power. If being a great power means we're actively making the lives of millions of people around the world miserable and keeping back progress for countries like Libya or Israel or Indonesia, then I don't think it's worth it, to be totally honest with you. I think a much more equitable power relationship makes sense. I think countries like Britain and France and Russia shouldn't be dominating the rest of the world.
What makes you think the public will be better at making these decisions than the elites at the moment? Are we not going to just end up polarising as we have again we're seeing in the Brexit vote, when we give the public these big, difficult decisions to make? What we've just left with is a big mess of people just fighting against each other.
So the gentleman asks is, what makes the public better at making decisions than the elites?
And will it not just
polarize? Yeah.
Listen,
polarization is good in politics. People taking sides on issues is good. In ancient Greece, there was a special name for those citizens who did not take a side on an issue. They called them idiots. And in the ancient Greek sense, that meant someone who only cared about their own well-being. They were the kind of person who'd wait to pick a side to see who's going to win and then maybe pick the winning side. So I actually think polarization is not a bad thing. The issue about making good decisions, though, yeah, that's interesting. The only way you can learn to make good decisions is by making decisions. I mean, people see this with their children, for example. You give them more and more responsibility as they get older, and they learn to use that responsibility. And I think the same applies across the national level. The more and more the public have been trusted with responsibility, such as giving women the vote, or giving working men the vote, or giving Irish Catholics the right to stand as MPs in Parliament. All of these progressive movements have been giving more people responsibility for decision making. It's just that now I think we're at the point where we're such generally speaking, quite an educated public. Very well educated. If you look at the rest of the world, a lot of the rest of the world, Britain's got a lot of resources at our disposal to learn about the issues of the day and make up our minds. I think we could.
By education, you mean political education?
Yeah, no, I don't mean getting a university degree. That's actually in many ways the opposite of an education. That's being taught how to do what you're told, and basically fulfill each and every one of your tutor's grading requirements. A real education you take for yourself. You don't just give it. You don't just get given it. And I think taking part in democratic assemblies is an educational process. You learn more and more how to make decisions. Remember, if you're going to make a motion in a local assembly. Can you start your question again, because I didn't hear it? Sorry, start it from the beginning. Sure. Do you know why they supported it? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now, this is a very good question. The man says here, well, look at the example of Libya. Most British people supported the attacks on Libya, right? And I'll give you there's other examples of this as well. Most British people think that Julian Assange was in the embassy of Ecuador willingly, and he wasn't being arbitrarily detained. That's what most British people think. Most British people, when English soldiers were on the line in Iraq, started to support the war. They went from not supporting it, but when they saw, remember, soldiers are risking their lives for political decisions, so naturally they get a lot of sympathy. Makes sense, right? Those are just three examples. Now, a lot of this is because of the media, so that's why we can't just democratize political decision making. We have to also, I think, democratize the means of communication. The reason why a lot of British people supported the attacks on Libya was because there was a very visceral claim made by the BBC, the Guardian, etc., that Colonel Gaddafi was giving his men Viagra, and he was telling them to go on like rape sprees. Also, there was a claim made that Colonel Gaddafi was he was going to ethnically cleanse Benghazi and get rid of its population. Now, ironically, the real ethnic cleansing began after the West invaded. When the West invaded, there was a lot of racists in Libya took their advantage. They took their chance to launch an attack on black Libyans in Libya. That actually happened after the Western invasion. But the media had this, remember in Iraq as well, there was a claim that Saddam Hussein's men were feeding human beings into shredders, paper shredders, and then using their bodies to feed the fishes, like fish food.
Come take over everything from your humanity. Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
He's from Uzbekistan. He came hundreds of years after. He doesn't know nothing about the Prophet. The people that know about the Prophet Muhammad is his family, Ali, Fatima, Hassan, Hussein, where the angel Gabriel came in their house and gave the revelation. Not to Uzbekistan, Bukhari, saying lies about the Prophet Muhammad in it. And people are dissing the Prophet Muhammad because of Bukhari.